The program we are about to present is a report on the homosexual lifestyle. We point that out for those who do not wish their children to see any portrayal of homosexual behavior.
Hey, I'm Andy Mills, and you're listening to Reflector. All right, let's talk about sex.
Okay.
And social movements.
Okay.
And people coming together to make a change and then maybe falling apart.
Yeah.
But first, who are you?
Sure. I am Ben Kawaller. I'm a 41-year-old homosexual, and I also do some reporting work.
Okay, so for today, the story of how a civil rights movement morphed into something more complicated. Over the course of the next 3 episodes, we're going to be hearing from some of the very people who created the LGBTQ coalition.
I was part of the group that appended the T to LGB. I'll take responsibility for that.
Including some who say that they do not recognize what it's become.
I'm sick of it all, Ben. I'm sick of it all.
I mean, I think we need to correct what's wrong first. And so that's a big thing, particularly the medicalization of children.
So we need to form alliances with people who may not pass the perfection test of the most progressive among us and realize, hey, we got to work together if we're going to stop this very dangerous onslaught that is upon us right now.
Ultimately, what we're going to do with this little mini-series is try and understand how and why a movement that in many ways had come to symbolize just how fast societies can change is now in the midst of a backlash and maybe even a breakup. And leading us through all of it will be very funny reporter Ben Kawaller.
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, so Ben, just start us off by explaining why it is you wanted to do this story.
So I came of age in the 90s and early 2000s, and I was a teenage activist for gay rights. And this was a time when the conversation was about gay marriage, gays in the military, issues that to me felt very black and white.
Yeah.
And this was also a time when it was generally just the gay rights movement, maybe the gay and lesbian rights movement. You know, you saw LGBT sometimes, but it wasn't what it is today, which is, you know, this sort of hodgepodge of letters, the LGBT or LGBTQ or LGBTQIA plus movement. And I never really knew how or why this collection of letters came together.
Interesting.
How did it come to be considered a cohesive community? What does it stand for now? And is it going to last? Because, frankly, it feels to me, and I hear this from other gays and lesbians a lot, that these different letters have really gotten to the point where we all kind of have different goals and ideas about sex and gender or even reality. And I wanted to go back and piece together how we all got together in the first place and why we might be about to break up.
All right, so let's go through it all step by step together.
Okay.
Where does that story begin?
Well, what we now call the LGBT or LGBTQ plus movement started as the gay rights movement. And let me try and phrase this as provocatively but as accurately as possible. The gay rights movement was a campaign for the right to engage in sexual conduct that most of the country found pathological and repulsive.
Most Americans are repelled by the mere notion of homosexuality. The CBS News survey shows that 2 out of 3 Americans look upon homosexuals with disgust, discomfort, or fear. 1 out of 10 says hatred. A vast majority favor legal punishment, even for homosexual acts performed in private between consenting adults.
Right, I think that sometimes people forget that actually it wasn't that long ago. That being gay was essentially against the law.
Yeah. Yeah, sodomy was illegal in 1960. Sodomy was illegal in all 50 states. It stayed illegal in nearly half the states through the 80s. And in some states, it wasn't legalized until 2003. And so up until that point, there were places in America where you could be arrested and imprisoned for doing butt stuff. Meaning, grown adults did not have the right to do as they pleased with each other in the bedroom or outside of the bedroom.
Uh-huh. And when is it that people started to organize to change that, to change society?
Well, today it's kind of popular to think of the start of the gay rights movement as the 1969 Stonewall Inn riots. This is when the police raided the Stonewall Inn, this gay bar in the West Village, which was something fairly common. But on this night, the gay men there decided to fight back and demand that they be allowed to congregate in this space without being harassed by the authorities. This eventually led to several days of street protests, which were commemorated a year later with the first Gay Pride Parade.
Thousands marched. They represented the mood of growing militancy in the United States gay community,
which now, of course, is an annual month-long celebration. But as galvanizing as Stonewall was, there were gay activists before Stonewall. 1950 saw the establishment of the Mattachine Society, for instance.
The Mattachine Society is dedicated to mutual understanding between society and the homosexuals.
The Mattachine Society was actually started in 1950 in Los Angeles by a member of the Communist Party. But anyway, probably the most famous member of the Mattachine Society was a guy named Frank Kameny, who in 1957 was fired from his civil service job for being a homosexual. He wasn't the first guy to be fired for being gay, but he was among the first to publicly challenge it, and he sued the Army. He'd been working for them as an astronomer. He wasn't successful in suing the Army, but this began a nearly 2 decades-long battle to allow gays to be employed by the federal government as civil service workers. Kameny would end up establishing the D.C. chapter of the Mattachine Society, and his political message and the political message of the Mattachine Society was pretty straightforward.
Every American citizen has the right to be considered by his government on the basis of his own personal merits as an individual.
I will not be deprived of my proper rights, freedoms, and liberties as I see them, or of a career, profession, and livelihood, or of my right to live my life as I choose to live it, so long as I do not interfere with the rights of others to do likewise.
So essentially, he's making the classic civil libertarian pitch here. This don't tread on me, right? The government can't tell me what to believe. I should be judged as an individual on my merits. And me being gay does not affect you, so you should let me be.
Right. And he was conscious of the fact that this was partly a political project, meaning partly a PR project. There was a really concerted effort to appear normal. You know, when the Mattachine Society would protest, they would wear suits and ties. They really didn't want to look crazy because they wanted people to like them.
Interesting. So he's leaning into this idea that I might be gay, but look at me. I'm just like you. I'm a normal guy.
Right. I'm only a leather daddy in my free time. But by the 70s, which is, of course, after the sexual revolution, after Stonewall,
if straight people can do it, why can't we?
We start seeing these new organizations like the Gay Liberation Front. And they are not at all trying to just fit in.
We are never going to support straight people who do not totally and unequivocally defend the gay rights of people in this country.
And they're interested not just in civil equality for gays and lesbians.
We are never going to support people who have pseudo-liberal answers to the political problems facing us,
but also the connection between gay liberation and racial justice or economic justice.
Okay, so you're saying that naturally, over time, you've got like some in the gay rights movement who are saying, hey, we're just like you. And you've got others who are saying, let's bring on the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, and there's always been, throughout the gay rights movement, this tension. There's a writer, Bruce Beyer, who summarized it as the difference between those who want a place at the table and those who want to turn the table over.
Got it.
People who are more sort of radical and people who were more assimilationist. And there were times when the different camps really got into it with each other.
It gives us a bad name. We should have the right to do it. If they can do it, we should be able to do it if we want to.
If we want to get a bad name for ourselves, right.
Okay, but were these different groups actually finding success in their overall mission?
Well, the Gay Liberation Front was fairly short-lived, actually. At one point, they were infiltrated by the FBI, who suspected them, not unreasonably, of being communists. So those guys didn't last too long. But there was a less radical offshoot called the Gay Activist Alliance.
Gay people, one of the only groups left in this country that it still seems to be safe to laugh at. And what we're here to say is that it's no longer safe or nice.
The word fairy is the most objectionable.
And these guys gained enough prominence to actually end up on late-night television.
There are many objectionable terms.
We're surely not fag and queen. Are they objectionable?
Yes, they are. Of course they are.
And this is like, what, the 1970s?
Yes.
The point is, many people who are sitting in this audience here, many people who are watching this show at home, may be gay people, and the people sitting next to them may not know that, and who are therefore loving a false image of those people. What we're doing now, working to change the law so that we can be protected in jobs and in housing, and have our civil rights along with every other minority group is important so that we will be viewed as the people that we are.
But beyond just being on network television, they were scoring victories in the 70s. One of them came in 1975, when the federal government finally stopped banning gay people from working civil service jobs. But the biggest leap forward in the 70s was the successful campaign to get the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is like the official catalog of mental conditions.
Yes, this is the famous DSM. And I also think it's a good reminder that it wasn't just illegal to be gay back then, but it was also considered by the medical establishment to be a mental condition.
Yeah. And this was a campaign that the Gay Activist Alliance took directly to the APA. They demonstrated at their conventions. They gave presentations there. They set up kissing booths. There was also a group within the APA that called themselves the Gay PA.
Very clever.
These were closeted gay psychiatrists. And one of them, at the 1972 convention, addressed the convention, of course, behind a mask, behind apparently a Richard Nixon mask and a wig and like a oversized suit. He confessed that he was gay and that the time had come to stop pathologizing homosexuality.
Interesting. And you're saying this worked?
Yeah. So as of 1973, we were no longer mentally ill. It was out of the asylum, into the bathhouse. Because in the 70s, urban gay men would spend just about every free moment having sex with each other. Occasionally pausing to campaign for an anti-discrimination ordinance or to protest Anita Bryant, but for the most part, we were really busy with other things.
A less political time.
But the thing that would really galvanize the gay community was the biggest catastrophe, of course, to ever befall us.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
The AIDS crisis. When AIDS started to appear in 1981, people didn't know what it was.
Topping the list of likely victims are male homosexuals who have many partners.
And all that people could see was that gay men were dying of these horrible infections that their immune systems should have been protecting them from.
Medical experts say the disease kills in that it threatens to explode in the nation's cities.
And over the next 15 years, around 300,000 Americans would die of AIDS-related diseases.
Jesus.
And AIDS wasn't just catastrophic medically. At least in the short run, it was catastrophic politically.
Proposals to find and segregate those exposed to AIDS.
We want to identify every person who's a carrier. We want to identify every possible way to stop them before it becomes a really serious national health threat.
You started to see even more fear and ostracizing of gay people. There were laws that essentially targeted gays in the name of public safety. Gays could be fired for being HIV positive. AIDS victims had no recourse for being evicted. There were politicians who wanted AIDS victims quarantined, despite the fact that AIDS couldn't be transmitted from casual contact. And you had a media that was still really uncomfortable with the idea of homosexuality.
When you got AIDS, did it make you think again about being gay? Did it make you rethink that lifestyle? Did it make you regret anything you'd done?
And activists and politicians who opposed gay rights on religious grounds were able to point to AIDS and say,
the Bible says if you engage in homosexuality, your body will do things that will penalize you.
Well, this is God's punishment.
Mm-hmm. Even in the 90s when I was growing up, my Sunday school teacher, I remember her telling me that AIDS had been a punishment sent from God to gay people for their unholy lifestyle.
They were also dealing with a government that didn't care about them. You know, President Reagan was famously indifferent to AIDS. He didn't mention AIDS until 1985.
AIDS brought an unprecedented level of visibility to our community because people couldn't hide because they were getting sick and they were dying.
This is Lorri Jean. She was the CEO of the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center in the 90s. And she told me
people were desperate. Their very lives were at stake.
And that in response to all of this, gay men started to organize.
They did things that had never been done before, like stage die-ins on the steps of the Food and Drug Administration and pour blood all over the steps and blockade the United States Supreme Court and do things like that at local level and at the federal level.
I mean, these were some of the more attention-grabbing tactics, but more consequentially, I think, AIDS patients and their allies raised money for medical research. They made connections within the FDA and the NIH. They became experts on medical research in their own right. They found allies in Congress who were able to secure federal funding for AIDS research. Within the community, they more or less invented the concept of safe sex, which was really no small thing. Activists pushed for emergency treatments, for medical trials, for expanding the scope of medical research beyond treatments favored by the establishment. And after many traumatizing years of this, there was a breakthrough.
If this is a medical miracle, it is a miracle that is now happening across the country, as new drugs taken in combination are giving thousands of people infected with the AIDS virus new hope.
There was still no cure, but in 1996, 15 years after the first documented case of AIDS, finally, a type of medicine called protease inhibitors emerged, and that turned HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic health condition.
All right, so what happens on the other end of the AIDS crisis to the broader movement in this fight for gay rights?
Well, AIDS decimated the leadership of the gay rights movement because, of course, so many gay men died. So one major shift was that you started seeing a lot more women in leadership roles. And one result of that was that gay often turned into gay and lesbian. So as for this mystery of how these letters came together, well, what was one letter had become two. A National Gay Task Force became the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, for instance. But also,
AIDS helped build what ultimately became the queer infrastructure that we have today.
The AIDS crisis was when some of the biggest and most powerful groups now were either coming into their own or being born, including the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which now just goes by GLAAD. So with AIDS no longer being a death sentence, and with this now much more organized gay rights infrastructure, gay and lesbian rights organizations could turn their sights towards political battles on the civil rights front.
Right, and what did that fight look like? What were their goals, and how did they go about trying to achieve them?
Well, the overall goal is wanting being gay to no longer be illegal. In 1996, sodomy was still prohibited in over a dozen states.
Yeah.
Gays couldn't serve openly in the military. Gays couldn't even form civil unions, let alone marriages. In fact, the 90s saw two major defeats for the gays on the federal level.
I have come here today to discuss our nation's policy toward homosexuals in the military.
President Clinton instituted Don't Ask, Don't Tell that barred gays from serving openly in the military, and he signed DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act.
The White House says the president has long opposed government recognition of homosexual marriages.
That barred the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriage. So we had this depressing legal fight that was suffering losses, but just as importantly, these groups waged an organized social campaign. For example, HRC, one of these groups whose mission was really shaped by the AIDS crisis, started looking to the private sector, pushing corporations to adopt anti-discrimination policies in hiring. They pressured companies into extending domestic partnership benefits to same-sex couples who worked for them. So, maybe you can't get married to your boyfriend, but you can be on his health insurance, just like a straight married couple would be able to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they found success there, largely because anti-gay discrimination was getting less and less popular among the public.
And why is that? Like you were saying earlier that in the 1960s, 2 out of every 3 Americans held a negative view towards homosexuals. What's changing in the 90s that's shifting the public's overall perception?
Well, there was a semi-organic, semi-engineered cultural shift that just changed the way people felt about gay people. This was something that I experienced as a gay teenager. I was like the head of my high school gay straight alliance, and there was an organization that promoted ideas like coming out day, which did not take off at my school, sadly. But more people just started coming out.
I'm very proud to have been lesbian all my life.
There was more visibility on television.
Men are hot.
Of gay characters.
I'm serious, I'm gay.
I'm gay.
We had Ellen DeGeneres, and they had...
The relationship between a man and a woman for the procreation of children is natural.
Pat Buchanan. Who was winning that popularity contest? And if people were not falling in love with the TV gays, they were starting to learn that gay people had been amongst their friends and family.
Right.
And in time, this social change starts paying dividends on the legal front. Most notably, a group called Lambda Legal would eventually end up overturning sodomy laws nationwide.
Right. This is the Supreme Court case from 2002, 2003?
2003.
So in a way, they successfully made it to where being gay is no longer illegal in America. And you also have the public who's growing more and more tolerant to the idea that being gay is not disgusting or awful. And this is all happening in the early 2000s. So where do things stand with the fight at this point?
Around 2000 is when you start seeing the phrase marriage equality getting popular. If you look on Google, that phrase didn't really exist before 2000. And at that time, there wasn't great national support for same-sex marriage. Again, we didn't even have civil unions, so this all just seemed like a pipe dream to a lot of people.
Right.
Formal opposition to gay marriage had been part of the GOP platform since 1992. And as for the Democrats, the best they could say was that they opposed DOMA, but that was hardly the same as saying, we are for marriage equality. We are for the rights of people to get married no matter their sexual orientation.
Yeah, I feel like people forget this now, but throughout the 2000s, the leading Democrats...
I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that.
I'm talking Obama, Biden, Hillary Clinton.
Marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman.
They were not subtle about their position on gay marriage.
Yeah. So because that's what we were seeing on the federal level, this was a fight that had to be focused on the states. So you had groups like the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. That's a different GLAAD. They brought the suit that would end up legalizing gay marriage in Massachusetts. You had groups like New York's Empire State Pride Agenda lobbying their legislature to pass same-sex marriage in New York.
I always think of this as the Andrew Sullivan era.
Ask yourself for a second whether any heterosexual citizen of this society has conceived for a second that they had a right to the pursuit of happiness, which did not include the right to marry the person they love.
I just remember that as state by state was changing different laws, he was going on C-SPAN, he was giving these public talks, he was essentially making the argument that this was a civil rights case of equality.
Right.
How much deeper can it get in the ability to be a full and developed human being than the right to marry the person you love?
And then slowly, I guess it was, if I'm remembering right, it was a lot of different blue states that were coming to change their laws.
Mostly blue, but you also had Iowa, which was purple. New Mexico's fairly purple. That didn't happen until 2013.
So it was a bit of a spectrum.
Yeah. And by 2012, anyway, same-sex marriage is legal in 9 U.S. states and D.C., and much of the gay establishment actually was content to continue this state-by-state approach. I mean, there was a wariness, actually, of any attempt to pursue a Supreme Court ruling on marriage because a lot of people just weren't sure that they had the votes.
Right, and if a Supreme Court decided that it wasn't constitutional, that might even upend the states where it had been legalized.
Exactly. But ultimately,
it's over.
They were wrong.
The long debate on whether gay couples have a constitutional right to marry is over, and the answer is yes.
2015, the Supreme Court decides in the case of Obergefell v. Hodges that gays and lesbians have a constitutional right to get married.
In doing so, they've reaffirmed that all people should be treated equally, regardless of who they are or who they love.
So in just the span of a few decades, we've gone from our sexual deviancy making us total social outcasts.
His favorite form of intercourse is with a goat.
To the President of the United States saying,
love is love.
Love is love.
All right, so this is when people start going, oh my God, look how fast things can change. Marriage equality is this win. It surprisingly kind of becomes a political non-issue. How does that end up changing the gay and lesbian rights movement and what they're going to focus on going forward?
Well, by the time 2015 had rolled around, it wasn't the gay and lesbian rights movement. It was now quite solidly the LGBT movement. And that meant that it was now time for the T's to have their moment. And to understand how he got there, we kind of need to go back a few years. And really, up until a few months ago when I started reporting on this, I thought I knew why the T's were part of the LGBT, but I was completely wrong.
More from Ben after a break. Stay with us.
Hey guys, this is Matt, co-founder here at Longview, where we believe in reporting that is worthy of your trust, grounded in curiosity and not political bias. And this original reporting is kind of expensive. So to pay for that, you are about to hear some ads. However, we are also listener supported. And if you would like to go ad-free and support our independent reporting at any dollar amount that you would like, you can do that by clicking on the link in our show notes or by going to longviewinvestigations.com. Until then, here's a brief message from our sponsors. Thanks.
Imagine always getting funny looks when you walk down the street. Or worse, being the target of violence, harassment, even death, just because you don't fit into the easy categories of he or she. That's the reality for transsexuals, cross-dressers, anyone who doesn't fit into the easy categories of male and female.
Welcome back to Reflector, and we're going to pick up now with Ben Kawaller, who was just about to tell us how the T's came to join up with the L's and the G's.
So first, a disclaimer. Gender nonconformity is not some new phenomenon. People who reject society's sex-based expectations on how they should dress or act, these people have been part of every human society to ever exist. What's varied is how accepting these societies are of gender nonconformity.
Mm-hmm.
So mostly, societies enforce gender roles and expectations quite rigidly, often violently. In the U.S., before anyone was using the modern language of gender politics, before anyone had even uttered the word transgender, there were laws on the books against cross-dressing, for instance.
Right. I mean, I just recently learned that even in cities like New York and New Orleans, into the 20th century, you could be arrested if you were a man walking around the streets wearing a dress, dressed like a quote-unquote woman.
Yeah. Now, in America, what started happening starting in the 1960s was, of course, the sexual revolution. And that brought a loosening of gender expectations like we had never seen before.
Right. This is the era where women are like boldly showing up for their office jobs.
Topless.
Well, not quite. In pants.
Ah, yes.
In female cut suits instead of these long dresses, that kind of a thing.
Right. But the modern transgender movement, what we now call the modern transgender movement in the U.S., started to emerge as such in the 1990s.
Just as gay people have been fighting for their liberation, transgender activists are coming out to fight for theirs.
Like at that point, even the word transgender was new.
In the olden times, trans was short for transsexual.
This is Dr. and early trans activist Dana Beyer. Dana is a reporter's dream. She's an open book.
When I actually completed my transition, my second wife said, "Oh, this is great and everything, but I don't want to live with a woman, so, we'll part." We're friends and stuff. I get along with both my exes, but it's like, yeah, there's a reality to this stuff.
It might surprise listeners to hear that you were married to two women. Certainly when I think, this is why I'm doing this podcast. I have all these assumptions and a narrative of my own that I don't really know if it's true. It just sort of seems true to me. I had always thought that the T's were sort of functionally gay men who liked to live as women. And so because we all sort of thought of them as gay men, sure, come along as well. It sounds like I'm totally wrong about...
You're totally wrong. You thought we were all drag queens.
I did. I don't know if I'd say it like that, but that's really something. So I basically thought, and this is somewhat embarrassing, that the T's were like gay plus, and they were not. You were active in the original fight to get the T's into the gay rights coalition.
I was part of the group that appended the T to LGB. I'll take responsibility for that.
And this was no small feat.
We were different, and our needs were different.
I should note that in the 90s, the word trans meant something somewhat different than what most people use it to mean now. And we'll talk more about that later. But for now, what's most important to know is that to the gay and lesbian establishment, this was not an obvious alliance. First of all, gays and lesbians were fighting for the right to have homosexual sex without penalization. And trans activists like Dana were fighting for the right to live as the opposite sex. Also, the transsexuals, as they called themselves at the time, who were the early leaders of the trans movement, were, for the most part, what we used to call M to F. These were biological males
who would actually undergo hormonal treatments or surgical treatments
and then live as women as best they could. But what I didn't realize is that they partnered romantically with women.
Okay, this is interesting. You're saying that one of the reasons that it was not obvious that the T's would join up with the G's and the L's is because the T's, broadly speaking, were not gay. They were kind of straight.
I mean, it depends on how you think of it. It depends on what you mean by gay. I mean, many of them would identify as lesbians. Of course, as you might imagine, other lesbians didn't often see them that way.
Right.
Which led to other tensions.
This being a bit messy, especially at first, makes total sense to me.
Yeah. And finally, there was a medical aspect to the trans movement that, by the 90s at least, didn't exist for the gay movement.
In general, most people understood that transsexual, transgender was a medical condition, whereas being gay was simply a form of, sexual orientation and romantic attraction and stuff.
Yeah, again, this makes sense to me because you have the G's who just were in this decades-long fight to demedicalize their sexuality, while the T's are in the midst of a fight to validate their need for medical care.
Exactly. So at first, gay rights movement, trans rights movement, separate entities.
Uh-huh.
But in the 90s and then into the early 2000s, that started to change because the transgender movement increasingly saw the benefits of joining ranks.
We wanted in to the building with the gay people because they had people in the Clinton administration back in the day, right? They had people who were walking the halls of Congress during the Bush administration. We wanted to be a part of that. We wanted to build allies.
In large part because they wanted it to be legal and affordable to change their bodies medically. And at the time when this movement for transsexual rights was getting off the ground, the gays had made tremendous inroads with the medical establishment fighting for AIDS research and treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd also managed to get homosexuality officially depathologized in the scientific literature.
In the DSM.
Yeah. So some of the T's start to really push to unite the gay rights movement and the trans rights movement.
Mm-hmm. And what did that look like? Like, how do the T's approach the G's to get into the same coalition?
Well, it looked like a bunch of things. So just like with gays and lesbians, within trans advocacy, there were people who favored confrontation and people who favored persuasion.
We decided to play the inside game and become respectable, sort of in the Frank Kameny model of, gay activism. We tried to persuade. We talked to people as equals. We tried to be fair.
There were trans activists exerting public pressure on gay organizations.
Politics from within.
There were also activists appealing to people that they knew personally.
I was an anti-trans before, but I had my consciousness raised about the transgender community and their needs.
For Lorri Jean, she said it was her friendship with a trans woman named Marsha Botzer that won her support.
I had deep conversations with her where I could be stupid and maybe even offensive. And I could ask questions that were in my heart and in my mind.
Do you remember any of those questions that you asked?
Oh, gosh. When I think about myself, I don't feel like I have a gender inside. I feel like inside I'm human. I don't feel male or female, even though I'm very proud to be a woman. And I had to come to understand that that's not everybody's experience.
But the argument that a bunch of people I spoke to said they found most persuasive emotionally was something that I think I best heard articulated by Jamison Green.
How we deal with our lives is not the business of politics. The business of politics is what rights do we have.
Who was one of the few trans men who was active in the movement at this time.
And, when somebody's beating up a masculine woman or a feminine man or a transsexual person or a drag queen or a cross-dresser or whoever, and they just start yelling, "You faggot," pounding on you, they don't differentiate. They're responding to a kind of prejudice that we all share being victims of. Whether we're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, we share that completely.
And ultimately, that argument, this idea that, okay, we may not be the same people fighting for the same thing, but we have the same enemies. You know, the people who bully us, who call us faggots and think we're scum, they don't know the difference.
Looking at it from the outside in, we're all a bunch of freaks.
And that is the argument that would win the day. So by 2004, HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, this group that played a big role in the fight for gay marriage and it became sort of the beating heart of the gay and lesbian movement at the time,
said, okay, we'll let you in the door. We'll append the T to LGB. And so we became part of the community.
We were officially now the LGBT movement.
Okay, so the T's have joined in hopes that uniting is going to help their cause. Does it?
Yeah. I mean, it sort of depends on what our timeline is here. But being part of this larger coalition gave the T's a lot more status. It got them plugged into these more organized and much bigger activist networks. And just as those networks had done for gay rights, they started making victories for trans rights as well. In 2013, this new coalition got the APA to change how it classified trans people in the DSM.
Changes to the so-called Bible of psychiatry.
Before 2013, being trans meant you suffered from gender identity disorder. And after this change, it was no longer a disorder at all. It was a condition called gender dysphoria.
As soon as the news about the DSM hit the public, it was just instantaneously spread across the internet through all these networks of transgender people from one part of this country to the other.
This change, it may just seem linguistic to some people, but given that, like with homosexuals, where for most of memorable history, we were thought of as depraved, sick,
deviants.
To have something go from being classified as a disorder to a more neutral description of how patients were describing the condition, which was a feeling of, I don't feel like my insides align with my outsides.
Yeah.
That was quite meaningful to the people who were experiencing dysphoria.
I mean, when I've interviewed trans people in the past, the way that they explained this change to me is that up until this moment, being trans, feeling that you are one sex or one gender in a different body, that was categorized somewhat like schizophrenia, right? Like hearing voices in your head. But now with this change, it was going to be seen as a condition, kind of like diabetes.
Yeah.
The idea being that like you can just get some medical interventions and live a quote unquote normal life.
Right. And whether or not you agree with that new definition, and many people don't, it was huge for many of the activists. I mean, this meant that healthcare providers and even health insurance companies would give greater access and cheaper care to people who wanted to get what we used to call a sex change without those people having to be labeled as disordered. So this big hurdle for many trans people was just leveled with that one sweeping change. However, as meaningful as this change was, there was an emerging tension in this coalition that was a sign of some of the troubles that lay ahead, some of the troubles that the movement is dealing with now. Turned out there were some other people who were part of this coalition, a group that didn't think that transness should be in the DSM at all. They thought of gender not as a state of body, but as a construct. They thought of transness not as a condition, but as an identity. And that tension, Andy, can be summed up in another letter.
All hell broke loose here with the queers.
Q.
We were using sex and gender synonymously in those days, and then the queers picked up the gender stuff and destroyed everything with that one weapon.
Next time on Reflector, how did the LGBT become the LGBTQ? And what kind of changes did that bring both to this coalition and to society as a whole? I promise you it is a very surprising story and far more consequential than you might expect.
Reflector is produced by Longview. If you aren't yet a supporter, you will hear part 2 of this story next week. However, if you'd like to support our original independent reporting and hear the next 2 episodes right now, all you have to do is click on the link in our show notes, and for whatever dollar amount you want, become a subscriber. You can also visit us at longviewinvestigations.com or leave a comment and sign up for our newsletter at longviewinvestigations.substack.com. Together, we are working to build a new media landscape that is rooted in curiosity, deeper thinking, and more open minds. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon.